If you ever hear an escape pod knocking from inside, don't open it, the old salvage captain once told me. Because whatever survived the crash probably isn't something you understand. I remembered that advice the moment my scanner picked up a faint life signal buried beneath the twisted hull of a wreck half a mile across the desert plain. The wind on Carthos 9 howled across the rust-colored dunes, carrying grains of metallic sand that rattled against my suit like dry rain. My display read -38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the exposed edges of the wreck had turned brittle and glassy. Perfect salvage conditions, assuming you didn't mind working alone on a dead world nearly 40 million miles from the nearest shipping lane. My name is Daniel Carter, salvage engineer, licensed by the Outer Trade Authority, though the license mostly meant I was allowed to dig through other people's mistakes without getting fined for it. The wreck in front of me had once been a sleek alien vessel, something fast and expensive judging by the crystalline engine rings scattered across the ground. Now it was a graveyard of curved metal and silent machinery. I stepped carefully over a fractured wing plate, my boots crunching across sand fused by the heat of re-entry. My suit lights cut through the dust as I followed the faint signal blinking on my wrist display. One life sign. Weak, but steady. That was strange. Most crashes out here ended with empty pods or frozen silence. The signal led me to a partially buried escape capsule wedged beneath a collapsed section of hull plating. The pod was smooth, elegant, nothing like the bulky Terran models I'd worked with before. Alien engineering always looked like sculpture pretending to be technology. Frost clung to its surface while thin lines of pale light pulsed along the seams. The life support was still running. I crouched beside it, brushing sand away from a small circular hatch. My gloves scraped across the metal with a soft hiss. Well, I muttered to the empty desert. Either someone's very lucky, or I'm about to have a very interesting day. The hatch release wasn't designed for human hands, but salvage work teaches you patience. After a minute of careful adjustments, the lock responded with a quiet chime, and the hatch slowly lifted upward. Cold air spilled out first, carrying a faint scent like ozone after a lightning storm. Then I saw her. She was taller than any human, even curled inside the narrow capsule, her skin a luminous shade of blue that caught the glow of my suit lights like polished glass. Long silver hair drifted weightlessly around her shoulders in the pod's low-gravity field. Armor fragments rested along her arms and collar, etched with symbols that looked ceremonial rather than military. Her eyes opened the instant the hatch cleared. Golden, sharp, alert in a way that made the back of my neck prickle even through a pressure suit. Before I could say a word, she moved with controlled precision, rising from the capsule and lifting a slender device that hummed with contained energy. She pointed it directly at my chest. The desert wind roared through the broken hull around us while snow-like dust spiraled in the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then the alien woman. No, not just a woman. Something about her posture carried unmistakable authority. Lifted her chin slightly and said in calm, perfectly translated English, "Human, explain why you have opened the escape pod of a royal vessel." Daniel Carter kept his hands exactly where they were, palms open and visible inside the thick gloves of his salvage suit. The wind continued to whistle through the shattered hull behind him, carrying thin streams of red dust that curled around the open escape capsule like smoke. The device in the alien woman's hand hummed softly, not loud, not threatening, but unmistakably powerful. Daniel had spent 12 years around enough alien technology to recognize the difference between a tool and something designed for very serious situations. He took a slow breath that fogged the inside of his visor and answered carefully. "Because your pod was transmitting a distress signal," he said. "Out here that usually means someone needs help." The golden eyes studying him did not blink. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a kind of restrained fury that felt older than the wrecked ship around them. The alien woman rose fully from the capsule now, standing nearly a foot taller than him even though Daniel measured 6 feet in his boots. Frost cracked softly beneath her bare feet as she stepped onto the metal floor of the broken hull. Up close, the faint glow of her blue skin reflected against the dark plating, giving her the strange appearance of someone carved from living starlight. "Your explanation is insufficient," she said, her voice calm but edged with authority. Humans do not operate this far beyond their territory without purpose. Daniel could not help a small tired smile at that. You would be surprised how many humans operate without a plan, he replied. Salvage work pays better if you are willing to travel. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the scattered wreckage beyond the hull opening. The desert stretched for miles in every direction, silent except for the relentless wind. For a moment Daniel thought she might lower the device. Instead, she raised her chin slightly. Identify yourself, she said. Daniel Carter. Licensed salvage engineer. Independent contractor. He gestured gently toward the battered rover parked about 30 yards away in the sand. My ship is about 3 miles north of here. I was scanning this wreck for recoverable systems when your signal appeared. The alien woman studied him in silence long enough that Daniel began to feel the cold creeping through the joints of his suit. Finally, she spoke again. You opened the pod knowing nothing about who might be inside. That is correct. You could have found a hostile species. Daniel shrugged inside the suit. Would not be the first time. That answer seemed to catch her off guard. The device in her hand lowered by an inch, though the faint hum did not fade. Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if reassessing something about him. Most beings would have waited for authorities, she said. Authorities are about 40 million miles away, Daniel replied. And judging by the condition of your ship, whoever caused that crash probably is not waiting politely for rescue crews. The wind surged again through the broken hull, scattering sand across the floor in thin lines. The alien woman turned her head toward the open desert, watching the horizon with the alert posture of someone who expected pursuit. When she spoke again, her voice carried less anger and more urgency. You said your vessel is nearby, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. 3 miles. Small salvage freighter. Not glamorous, but it flies. Her golden eyes returned to him. For the first time, the fierce tension in them softened into something else. Calculation. Curiosity. Perhaps even reluctant consideration. She lowered the humming device completely. Human Daniel Carter, she said quietly. If what you claim is true, then you have just interfered with matters far beyond your understanding. Daniel looked out at the endless red desert, then back at the glowing blue figure standing in the ruined hull of a royal escape capsule. Yeah, he said calmly. That sounds about right. The wind across Carthos 9 carried a hollow whistle through the broken hull of the alien vessel as Daniel Carter watched the blue-skinned stranger study the distant horizon. Something about the way she stood told him she was not simply worried about the cold or the wreckage. She was listening for something. After nearly a minute, she turned back toward him, and the golden glow of her eyes reflected faintly against the glass of his helmet. Your vessel, she said calmly. It is capable of leaving this planet immediately. Daniel tilted his head slightly. It is capable of leaving, he replied. Immediately depends on how much you enjoy flying with a half-repaired navigation system. For the first time since she stepped out of the escape capsule, a faint shift crossed her expression. Not quite amusement, but something close to it. You speak with unusual calm for a human standing in the wreckage of a royal warship, she said. Daniel shrugged slowly. Experience, he answered. Salvage work teaches you that panic rarely fixes broken machines. The princess glanced once more at the scattered remains of her vessel. Long curved fragments of crystal alloy protruded from the sand like the ribs of some enormous skeleton. The fading sunlight reflected off their surfaces in pale violet flashes. This ship carried more than machines, she said quietly. Its destruction will not go unnoticed. Daniel followed her gaze across the horizon. The sky of Carthos 9 had begun to darken into a deep copper color as the system's distant star lowered behind the mountains. Thin clouds of metallic dust drifted through the air like slow-motion snow. Let me guess, he said. Someone might come looking. They will come, she corrected. Her voice remained composed, but there was a weight behind the words now that had not been there before. And if they find me here with a human scavenger, the conclusions they draw will be inconvenient for you. Daniel let out a quiet breath. I appreciate the concern. She looked directly at him again, studying the lines of his worn salvage suit and the scratched plates of his shoulder armor. You still do not understand the situation, she said. That wreck belonged to the Imperial fleet of the Veiled Dominion. Daniel blinked once inside his helmet. Dominion, he repeated, as in the same people who control 3-star systems and most of the trade routes between them. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly. Well, that explains the fancy escape pod. The princess watched him carefully, as if expecting some stronger reaction. When none came, she spoke again. Human Daniel Carter, your presence here has already altered events that were carefully arranged by forces you have never met. That happens more often than you would think, Daniel said mildly. The wind picked up again, and a stream of cold dust slid across the metal floor between them. The princess raised one slender hand and brushed a strand of silver hair away from her face. The faint light of her skin glowed brighter in the gathering dusk. Your ship is 3 miles north, she said after a moment. Can it sustain atmospheric flight for several hours? Daniel nodded. Easily. Then we leave now. The statement came not as a request, but as a quiet command. Daniel considered that for about 2 seconds. All right, he said. But I should warn you that my vessel was not designed to transport royalty. A faint glimmer returned to her eyes. After today, she replied softly, I suspect comfort will be the least unusual part of this journey. Daniel turned toward the broken opening in the hull and began walking toward his rover parked in the red sand. After a few steps, he realized the princess was walking beside him, silent and graceful despite the frozen desert beneath her feet. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, a distant rumble echoed through the sky, like the low hum of engines entering the atmosphere. And for the first time since opening the escape pod, Daniel Carter began to suspect that rescuing one mysterious survivor might have just made him part of something much larger than a salvage job. Daniel Carter's rover growled softly as its electric motors pushed through the deep red sand, the headlights cutting pale tunnels through the growing darkness of Carthos 9. The wreck of the alien vessel slowly disappeared behind them, swallowed by wind and distance until it became nothing more than a jagged silhouette against the fading copper sky. Inside the rover's reinforced cabin, the heater hummed steadily, pushing warm air through the vents while the external temperature continued to fall toward minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel kept both hands lightly on the steering controls, guiding the vehicle along a narrow route his scanners had mapped earlier that day. Beside him, the alien princess sat perfectly still, her tall frame folded with quiet composure into the passenger seat. The faint glow of her blue skin reflected softly against the dashboard instruments, turning the interior of the rover into a dim ocean-colored light. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Only the wind sliding across the armored windows and the steady vibration of the rover's tires against the frozen sand filled the silence. Finally, the princess turned her head slightly toward the front windshield, where distant lightning flickered silently along the horizon. You travel alone on a world like this, she said. Most beings would consider that an unnecessary risk. Daniel shrugged as he guided the rover around a ridge of frozen rock. Most beings do not make a living pulling broken technology out of deserts, he answered. Solitude comes with the job. She considered that quietly, her golden eyes studying the faint digital maps moving across the rover's navigation display. Your species is unusual, she said. Humans are still new to this region of space, yet you appear comfortable wandering beyond your borders. Daniel smiled faintly. Comfortable might be a generous description, he said. Curious is probably more accurate. The princess tilted her head slightly, as if examining that word from several angles. Curiosity, she repeated softly. Among my people, that trait is usually restricted to scientists and explorers, not salvage workers. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Trust me, princess, salvage work requires curiosity more than anything else. You never know what you are going to find inside a wreck. The rover crested a long dune, and the distant outline of Daniel's ship finally appeared against the darkening sky. The vessel rested on 3 wide landing struts nearly half a mile ahead, its worn metal hull reflecting the weak glow of the planet's rising moon. It was not a large craft, barely 80 feet from nose to engine ring, but it carried the solid practical design of a machine that had crossed a lot of lonely space. The princess leaned slightly forward, studying the ship with careful attention. That vessel belongs to you, she said. It does, Daniel replied. She is called the Horizon Breaker. Not the most elegant name in the galaxy, but she flies. The rover rolled to a stop near the landing ramp, and the external lights of the ship flickered on automatically as the proximity sensors recognized Daniel's signal. A narrow staircase lowered with a mechanical hiss, and warm yellow light spilled across the red sand. Daniel powered down the rover and glanced toward his unusual passenger. "Welcome to my home away from home," he said calmly. The princess stepped out onto the frozen desert and looked up at the modest salvage freighter towering above them. For the first time since leaving the wreck, her expression softened into something almost thoughtful. "Human Daniel Carter," she said quietly. "I suspect your quiet ship is about to become a very important place." Daniel followed her gaze toward the sky, where the distant stars were beginning to appear one by one. Somewhere far above the atmosphere, faint streaks of light were moving slowly across the darkness, like silent ships searching the planet below. Warm air rushed over Daniel Carter's face as the cargo hatch of the Horizon Breaker sealed behind them with a solid metallic thud that echoed through the narrow interior corridor. The sudden silence felt almost unreal after the endless wind outside. Inside the ship, the temperature climbed quickly towards 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and the faint smell of machine oil and warm circuitry filled the air. Daniel removed his helmet and clipped it to a wall hook beside the entry hatch, running a hand through his wind-tangled brown hair before glancing toward his unexpected passenger. The alien princess stepped inside slowly, her bare feet touching the metal floor with quiet precision as her glowing blue skin reflected softly against the dim ceiling lights. For a moment, she simply looked around. The Horizon Breaker was not luxurious by any standard. The corridor walls were lined with tool racks, spare wiring coils, and sealed cargo crates stacked neatly against the bulkheads. A small navigation console blinked softly near the cockpit entrance while the steady vibration of the ship's life support system hummed beneath the floor plating. To Daniel it looked ordinary. To her it clearly did not. Her golden eyes moved from one piece of equipment to the next with careful attention. "This vessel is practical," she said. Finally, Daniel smiled slightly. "That is the nicest way anyone has ever described it." She stepped farther inside, running her gaze across the exposed hydraulic supports and patched sections of wall plating. "You maintain it alone," she said. "Yes." "No crew." "No crew." She nodded thoughtfully, absorbing that information as if it told her something important about him. Daniel walked past her into the cockpit and began flipping a series of switches along the control panel. The Horizon Breaker responded immediately. Soft lights brightened along the dashboard, and the engines far behind the hull began warming with a distant rising hum. The princess followed him quietly and stood near the co-pilot's seat while he worked. Through the forward window, the desert stretched endlessly under the pale light of the rising moon. Above that sky, the faint streaks of distant ships were now clearer than before. Several small points of light drifted slowly across the upper atmosphere, moving with the unmistakable precision of controlled flight. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the radar screen as it updated. 3 unidentified vessels, possibly more entering orbit. He exhaled slowly. "Those friends of yours?" he asked calmly. The princess did not look surprised. "Search vessels," she replied. "Not necessarily friendly ones." Daniel nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Then I suppose it is a good thing we did not stay near the wreck." She looked at him carefully. "You are not alarmed." "I prefer to save that reaction for situations I can actually fix," Daniel answered. "Right now I can still fly away from this one." He tapped the final switch, and the ship's navigation system projected a glowing star map across the cockpit display. Blue routes traced possible exit paths through the upper atmosphere. The princess watched the holographic map with quiet fascination. "Your technology integrates easily with ours," she said. "Humans are good at adapting things," Daniel replied, "especially when it helps us survive." The engine hum deepened, vibrating gently through the cockpit floor as the Horizon Breaker prepared for launch. Outside, the stars continued to brighten, while the distant lights of searching ships moved slowly across the sky like patient hunters. The princess folded her hands calmly behind her back and looked forward through the cockpit glass. "Human Daniel Carter," she said softly. "Once we leave this planet, your quiet life as a salvage engineer will not return to normal." Daniel adjusted the thruster controls and glanced at her with a relaxed expression. "Princess," he said, "my life stopped being normal the moment I opened that escape pod." The ship's engines roared gently to life, and the Horizon Breaker began to lift from the frozen desert floor, while the distant lights in orbit slowly shifted position, as if they had finally noticed something rising from the surface of Carthos 9. The horizon breaker climbed steadily through the thin upper layers of Carthos 9's atmosphere, the desert below shrinking into a rust-colored ocean under the silver glow of the planet's moon. Daniel Carter kept one hand lightly on the control column while the other adjusted the engine output as the ship pushed past 30,000 feet and continued rising. Outside the cockpit window, the blackness of space slowly replaced the dusty sky, and the faint stars ahead began to sharpen into bright, steady points of light. Inside the cockpit, the engines produced a deep, steady vibration that traveled through the metal frame of the ship like the quiet heartbeat of a machine that had crossed many lonely systems. The alien princess remained standing beside the co-pilot's seat, watching the ascent with calm focus, while the holographic star map projected across the navigation panel cast blue light across her glowing skin. Daniel glanced briefly at the radar display and noticed several signals shifting position in high orbit. They had been slow before, drifting like distant satellites, but now the markers were adjusting course. He leaned back slightly in his chair and gave a quiet sigh. "Well," he said calmly, "they definitely noticed us." The princess studied the radar screen without surprise. "Their sensors would detect your engine ignition immediately," she said. "The fleet vessels in this region are designed to monitor planetary activity." Daniel nodded. "Good to know my ship is interesting enough to attract attention." The horizon breaker passed the final boundary of the atmosphere and entered open space with a gentle shudder as the engines transitioned from atmospheric thrust to vacuum propulsion. The stars outside the cockpit window now stretched across the darkness in brilliant clarity, while the pale curve of Carthos 9 rotated slowly beneath the ship. Daniel increased power slightly and guided the vessel along a shallow arc away from the planet. The princess turned toward him with quiet curiosity. "You are not accelerating." "At maximum output," she observed. Daniel smiled faintly. "Running away too fast tends to attract even more attention," he said. "Right now we look like a harmless salvage ship leaving orbit." She considered that logic for a moment before nodding slowly. "Your caution is reasonable." The radar display flickered again as one of the distant signals shifted closer. Daniel tapped the screen and magnified the data. The vessel was large, nearly 500 feet long judging by the sensor reflection. Elegant lines, energy signatures far beyond anything his modest freighter could match. He leaned forward slightly. "That one looks expensive," he said quietly. The princess followed his gaze toward the glowing radar marker. "Imperial patrol cruiser," she said. "One of several assigned to protect the Dominion border." Daniel let out a slow breath. "Then I suppose they are looking for you." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the cockpit window and watched the distant cruiser move slowly against the stars. "They are looking for information," she said after a moment. "My disappearance will create many questions." Daniel glanced at her. "And if they discover you are aboard a human salvage vessel?" Her golden eyes reflected faintly in the glass as she answered. "Then those questions will become much more complicated." The horizon breaker continued gliding quietly through the darkness while the patrol cruiser adjusted its trajectory in the distance. Daniel reached over and activated the ship's long-range navigation computer. A new star chart appeared, displaying dozens of possible routes through nearby systems. He studied them carefully while the engines hummed around him. "Princess," he said calmly, "if we want to avoid that cruiser, we should decide where we are going next." She turned away from the stars and looked directly at him. For the first time since he had opened the escape pod, her expression held something almost thoughtful rather than guarded. "Human Daniel Carter," she said quietly, "that decision may affect far more than your next destination." Outside the cockpit, the patrol cruiser's signal grew slowly brighter on the radar display, while the small salvage ship carrying an unexpected passenger continued drifting deeper into the silent ocean of stars. The patrol cruiser's signal grew brighter on the horizon breaker's radar display as the small salvage ship drifted quietly away from Carthos 9. Daniel Carter leaned forward in his chair, studying the movement of the glowing marker as it slowly adjusted course. The cruiser was not accelerating aggressively, but it was clearly repositioning itself between his ship and the most direct exit route from the system. Outside the cockpit window, the stars remained calm and silent, indifferent to the quiet game of positioning that had just begun in orbit around the lonely desert planet. Daniel tapped a command into the navigation console, and the holographic map shifted to show a wider view of the surrounding star systems. Blue lines traced potential travel routes, some leading toward established trade lanes, and others disappearing into the emptier regions of space. The alien princess stood beside the window watching the distant cruiser with steady attention. Her glowing skin reflected faintly in the glass as the ship's instruments cast soft light across the cockpit. "They are observing," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That is usually how these situations start." He glanced down at the scanner readings again. "They are also scanning our hull signature." The princess turned slightly toward him. "Your vessel will be identified as a human salvage freighter within moments." Daniel gave a relaxed shrug. "That part is not a problem." "Explain." He leaned back in the pilot's seat and gestured toward the navigation panel. "Human ships operate all over the outer systems. A lone freighter leaving orbit does not look suspicious unless it suddenly tries to run." She studied him carefully. "You are deliberately appearing harmless." "Exactly." The patrol cruiser continued drifting closer on the radar display, its signal now bright enough that the system began estimating its exact size and engine configuration. The data confirmed Daniel's earlier guess. The cruiser was massive compared to the Horizon Breaker, a sleek Imperial vessel designed for command and control rather than speed. The princess folded her hands behind her back and observed the radar screen. "Eventually they will request identification," she said. Daniel nodded again. "And I will give it to them." Her golden eyes narrowed slightly. "You would allow them to inspect your vessel." "Not inspect," Daniel corrected calmly. "Just identify." He reached toward the console and activated the ship's external broadcast system. The comm panel glowed softly as it prepared a standard civilian transponder signal. "Right now we are just another ship leaving a salvage site." The princess remained silent for several seconds while the patrol cruiser's sensors swept across the Horizon Breaker. A faint vibration passed through the hull as the scan touched the ship's systems and moved on again. Daniel watched the readings carefully until the scanner beam faded. "There," he said quietly. "They have our profile." The princess looked out through the cockpit window again. Far in the distance, the cruiser had slowed its approach slightly, as if reconsidering its interest in the small freighter drifting away from the planet. "You are surprisingly confident," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Confidence is cheaper than fear." The navigation computer chimed softly as it finalized several possible exit routes from the system. Daniel examined the projected paths carefully while the patrol cruiser held its distant position. "If we leave now at low acceleration," he said thoughtfully, "they will assume we are heading toward the outer trade corridor." The princess turned toward him. "But we are not." Daniel glanced up at her glowing reflection in the cockpit glass. "No," he said calmly. "We are going somewhere they will not expect." Outside, the Horizon Breaker continued gliding deeper into the darkness of space, while the massive cruiser lingered near the orbit of Carthos 9, watching the small human freighter disappear slowly among the stars. The Horizon Breaker continued its quiet drift through the dark expanse beyond Carthos 9, while the distant patrol cruiser remained behind in orbit, like a patient sentinel watching the system. Daniel Carter adjusted the ship's course by a few degrees, and the navigation computer updated the star map with a new projected route that curved away from the expected trade corridor. The engines maintained a low steady output, just enough to carry the small freighter farther from the planet without drawing attention. Outside the cockpit window, the planet's copper-colored surface slowly shrank until it became a small glowing sphere against the darkness of space. The alien princess remained standing near the forward glass, her posture calm but attentive as she studied the shifting constellations ahead. "Your course does not lead toward any established shipping lane," she observed. Daniel nodded while scanning the sensor display. "That is intentional." The princess turned slightly toward him. "You are leaving the monitored routes." "Exactly." He tapped the navigation panel and expanded a section of the holographic map that showed a region of sparse traffic beyond the Dominion border. "Out here there are fewer patrols, fewer cargo convoys, and fewer questions." The princess watched the glowing map for a moment. "Your people travel these regions frequently." Daniel gave a small smile. "Humans are very good at finding places where larger powers are not paying attention." The Horizon Breaker adjusted its heading slightly as the navigation computer corrected the trajectory. A faint blue arc appeared across the display, marking the ship's projected jump vector once it reached safe distance from the system's gravity well. The princess studied the data with growing interest. Your vessel is equipped for faster-than-light travel. It is, Daniel replied. Not the fastest drive in the galaxy, but reliable. She nodded slowly. Then once we leave this system, the patrol cruiser will lose track of us. Daniel leaned back in the pilot's seat. That is the idea. For a few seconds the cockpit fell silent again, except for the low hum of the engines and the occasional soft tone from the navigation computer. Outside, the stars appeared brighter now that the ship had cleared the last faint haze of planetary dust. The princess continued studying the unfamiliar star patterns ahead. Human Daniel Carter, she said quietly. You have not asked the most obvious question. Daniel glanced toward her. Which one? Why I was alone in that escape capsule. He considered that briefly before answering. I assumed you would tell me when you were ready. The princess seemed genuinely surprised by that response. Her golden eyes studied him carefully, as if trying to understand something that did not match her expectations. Most beings would demand an explanation immediately, she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. Most beings are not responsible for keeping a salvage ship flying. When you spend enough time alone in space, you learn that answers usually arrive eventually. She turned back toward the stars beyond the cockpit glass, silent for several seconds while the horizon breaker continued its steady escape from the system. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. The destruction of my ship was not an accident. Daniel did not react outwardly, but he watched the sensor display carefully as the ship approached the edge of the system's gravitational boundary. I figured as much, he said calmly. The princess lowered her gaze slightly, as if weighing how much to reveal. There are factions within the Dominion who would prefer that I never reach the capital again. Daniel let out a slow breath while the navigation computer signaled that the ship was nearly clear for jump. Well, he said thoughtfully, that explains why you looked so concerned about those patrol ships. The princess looked toward him again, and the faint glow of the instrument lights reflected in her golden eyes. Human Daniel Carter, she said softly. You may have just become involved in a conflict that extends across several star systems. Daniel reached forward and armed the horizon breaker's jump drive, while the stars outside the cockpit window stretched into long, thin lines of light. Princess, he replied calmly. That tends to happen when you open mysterious escape pods. Stars stretched into brilliant lines across the cockpit window as the horizon breaker entered faster than light travel with a smooth rising hum that vibrated through the metal frame of the ship. Daniel Carter kept his hands steady on the controls while the navigation computer stabilized the jump corridor ahead of them. The sudden silence of deep space surrounded the vessel as the last traces of the Carthos 9 system vanished behind them. For a few seconds, neither Daniel nor the alien princess spoke. The ship moved through the glowing tunnel of distorted starlight, while the instruments confirmed a stable trajectory toward a quiet region several light years away. Daniel finally leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced toward the princess. All right, he said calmly. We have a little time before the jump finishes. You mentioned factions inside your dominion. The princess remained near the forward window watching the flowing light outside, as if it were an ocean current carrying them far from the danger behind. Her glowing blue skin reflected softly in the cockpit glass. Yes, she answered quietly. The Dominion appears unified to outsiders, but power among the ruling houses has always been competitive. Daniel smiled faintly. Politics. That part sounds familiar. She turned toward him slowly. The ship you discovered was transporting me to the capital system for a diplomatic council. My arrival would have confirmed several agreements that some houses do not support. Daniel tapped a small diagnostic panel while he listened. So someone decided it would be easier if you never arrived. Correct. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind the words now. Daniel considered that for a moment while the ship's engines continued their steady hum. And now they will assume you were lost with the wreck. That is likely. What they hope. She paused before continuing. However, the patrol vessels searching the system suggest that not everyone believes that story. Daniel nodded slowly, meaning someone suspects you survived. The princess looked toward the navigation display where the projected jump path glowed across the holographic map. Or someone wants to confirm the truth personally. Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully while the horizon breaker continued traveling through the corridor of light. That explains why the patrol cruiser looked interested in our ship. She studied him again with that same careful curiosity she had shown since leaving the escape pod. You remain remarkably calm about all of this. Daniel shrugged. Out here in the outer systems, problems usually arrive one at a time. Today just happens to be an exception. For a moment, the princess almost smiled, a subtle expression that softened the sharp authority in her eyes. Then she grew serious again. Human Daniel Carter, if the wrong faction discovers that I survived and that a human pilot assisted me, they will not simply ignore you. Daniel glanced at the glowing star lines outside the cockpit. I figured that part out already. The navigation computer chimed softly, indicating that the jump corridor was nearing its exit point. The flowing light beyond the cockpit window began slowly compressing back into distinct stars. Daniel adjusted the control column gently as the ship prepared to return to normal space. So, he said calmly, where exactly were you planning to go before your ship was destroyed? The princess hesitated for the first time since revealing her situation. Originally, I would have gone directly to the Dominion capital. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And now? She looked out at the stars ahead of them as the jump corridor faded completely. Now, she said quietly, I believe I must first reach a place where no Dominion fleet would think to search. The horizon breaker slipped back into normal space among a distant cluster of unfamiliar stars, and Daniel Carter had a strong feeling that wherever they had just arrived was only the beginning of a much larger journey. The stars outside the horizon breaker stabilized as the ship completed its jump and drifted into a quiet region of space far from the busy trade routes Daniel Carter normally used for salvage work. The navigation console chimed softly as the sensors began scanning the unfamiliar system. A pale blue star burned quietly in the distance, surrounded by a loose collection of asteroids and faint dust clouds that shimmered like silver fog in the vacuum. Daniel leaned forward slightly and adjusted the long-range scanners while the engines settled into a calm, idle vibration beneath the cockpit floor. Well, he said thoughtfully, this place certainly qualifies as somewhere nobody would bother looking. The alien princess stepped closer to the navigation display, studying the slowly updating sensor readings with careful attention. The faint glow of her skin illuminated the console, as if the cockpit lights had dimmed just for her presence. Your navigation skills are impressive, she said quietly. This region sits beyond several mapped Dominion patrol paths. Daniel gave a small shrug. Salvage pilots learn where the quiet corners of space are. Fewer authorities means fewer complications. The scanners finished their initial sweep, and the holographic star map expanded across the display, marking several rocky bodies drifting in wide orbit around the system's star. Daniel zoomed the map inward until a cluster of large asteroids appeared. The irregular shapes rotated slowly in the projection like silent mountains floating through darkness. Those rocks will work, he said. The princess looked toward the map. Explain. Daniel tapped the screen and highlighted one of the larger asteroids nearly 3 miles across. Asteroid shadows scatter sensor signals. If we park the ship close to that surface, most long-range scans will see nothing but mineral interference. The princess watched the projection for a moment before nodding. You have done this before. Daniel smiled faintly. More times than I can count. The horizon breaker adjusted course slightly and began gliding toward the drifting asteroid cluster while the distant blue star cast a cold, gentle glow across the cockpit window. The quiet movement of the rocks reminded Daniel of snowflakes floating through an endless night. After a few minutes, the princess spoke again, her voice calmer now that they had distance from the Dominion patrols. Human Daniel Carter, there is something you should understand about the situation you have entered. Daniel kept his attention on the approaching asteroid while he listened. I am listening. She paused briefly as if choosing her words carefully. Within the Dominion, my position is not only ceremonial. My arrival at the capital was intended to finalize an alliance that would shift the balance of power among several ruling houses. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly, meaning your survival matters to more people than just your friends. Yes, she said quietly. And unfortunately, it also matters to those who oppose that alliance. The asteroid field grew larger outside the cockpit window until the closest rocks appeared as towering cliffs of gray stone, turning slowly in the silent vacuum. Daniel guided the horizon breaker carefully between 2 massive fragments and reduced the engine output to almost nothing. The ship drifted gently into the shadow of the largest asteroid while the navigation computer displayed a stable position hidden within the mineral interference. He exhaled quietly and leaned back in his seat. There, he said. For the moment, we are invisible. The princess studied the surrounding rocks through the cockpit glass. A hidden refuge, she said softly. Daniel nodded once. Temporary, but effective. She turned toward him again, and the thoughtful expression in her golden eyes had returned. Human Daniel Carter, you opened my escape pod without knowing who I was. Daniel shrugged lightly. That part has already been established. Most beings would not have taken such a risk. Daniel looked out at the silent asteroid field surrounding his ship. Most beings probably would have left the pod closed. The princess regarded him for a long moment as the quiet ship floated within the shadow of stone and starlight. And for the first time since their journey, she spoke with a tone that carried both curiosity and something that sounded very close to respect. The horizon breaker rested quietly within the shadow of the massive asteroid, while the distant blue star of the system cast faint silver light across the jagged stone outside the cockpit window. Daniel Carter leaned back in his pilot's seat and let the steady hum of the ship's life support system fill the silence. For the first time since leaving Carthos 9, there was no urgent movement on the radar screen, no distant patrol signals, no rising alarms from the navigation computer. Only the slow drift of ancient rock and the calm breathing of a small ship hidden among them. The alien princess remained standing beside the forward window with her hands loosely folded behind her back as she studied the quiet asteroid field. The soft glow of her blue skin reflected across the cockpit glass, like moonlight on water. After several long seconds, she spoke again. Human Daniel Carter, I have encountered many species across the Dominion's borders. Daniel turned slightly toward her, but did not interrupt. Her voice carried a thoughtful tone now, far different from the sharp command she had used when he first opened the escape pod. Most civilizations behave predictably when confronted with power, she continued. They become cautious, defensive, or opportunistic. Daniel gave a faint smile. Humans can do all of those things too. The princess glanced at him briefly. Yes, she said quietly. But you did something different. Daniel rested his elbows lightly on the armrests of his chair, opening the pod again. Yes. She turned away from the window and faced him fully now. Her golden eyes were steady but no longer guarded. You had no knowledge of who I was or what danger might follow me. Yet you chose to help without hesitation. Daniel shrugged in the relaxed way of someone who had spent years solving practical problems alone in deep space. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. The princess studied him carefully, as if that answer carried more meaning than the words themselves. Among my people, decisions are rarely made without careful calculation, she said. Actions always serve strategy. Daniel chuckled softly. Humans like strategy too. We just do not always let it stop us from helping someone. For a moment the cockpit fell silent again, while the ship drifted gently within the protective shadow of the asteroid. The navigation computer displayed quiet streams of sensor data across the console, while faint starlight shimmered beyond the glass. The princess walked slowly toward the co-pilot's seat, but did not sit. Instead, she rested one hand lightly on the edge of the console and looked down at the navigation map, glowing between them. Human Daniel Carter, she said thoughtfully. The alliance I was traveling to confirm would have strengthened cooperation between the Dominion and several independent systems. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Including human territory. She nodded once. Yes. Daniel leaned back again and considered that for a moment. Then I suppose whoever destroyed your ship wanted that cooperation to fail. That is correct. The princess looked toward the asteroid outside as it rotated slowly through space. Without my testimony, the council may hesitate to finalize the agreement. Daniel watched the quiet system around them while the realization settled in. Meaning if you reach the capital alive, the balance of power changes. The princess met his gaze again, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. Exactly. Daniel exhaled slowly and glanced at the ship's navigation panel. Then hiding here forever is not really an option. A faint expression touched the princess's face, something that looked almost like quiet determination. No, she said softly. It is not. Daniel turned his chair toward the control panel and began studying the surrounding star systems displayed across the map. Well, princess, he said calmly, If the galaxy is waiting for you to arrive somewhere important, we should probably start figuring out the safest way to get you there. The asteroid field drifted silently around the horizon breaker while the small human ship and its unexpected passenger prepared to plan a journey that might reshape far more than either of them had imagined when an escape pod opened on a frozen desert world. The asteroid outside the cockpit window rotated slowly like a silent mountain drifting through darkness, while the horizon breaker remained hidden within its shadow. Daniel Carter studied the holographic star map projected above the navigation console, tracing several possible routes with his finger as faint blue lines appeared across the display. Each path wound through quiet regions of space, avoiding Dominion patrol zones and heavily monitored trade lanes. None of them were simple. The alien princess stood beside him watching the map with careful focus. Her glowing blue skin cast soft light across the navigation panel while distant stars shimmered beyond the cockpit glass. "You are calculating a path that avoids Dominion space entirely," she said after a moment. Daniel nodded. "At least until we get closer to the capital system." He highlighted a cluster of independent systems that formed a loose arc across the map. "If we travel along these outer colonies, we can approach from a direction nobody expects." The princess considered the route quietly. "Those systems are not formally allied with the Dominion." "Exactly," Daniel replied. "They are also full of traders, prospectors, and travelers who mind their own business." She studied the glowing route lines again. "Your people operate among these worlds frequently." Daniel smiled slightly. "Humans tend to show up anywhere commerce and curiosity intersect." The navigation computer chimed softly as it calculated fuel requirements and jump distances along the proposed route. Several stars along the path turned green, indicating stable jump points. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms while the system finalized the data. "If we leave the asteroid field in about 2 hours," he said thoughtfully, "we can make the first jump before any long-range scanners sweep this region again." The princess turned toward the cockpit window and watched the slow movement of the surrounding rocks. For a moment she said nothing, and Daniel could see that she was weighing more than just navigation decisions. Finally she spoke again. "Human Daniel Carter, once I reach the capital, there will be consequences for those who attempted to prevent my arrival." Daniel raised one eyebrow, but remained calm. "Politics again." "Yes," she said quietly. "However, the council will also ask how I survived." Daniel chuckled softly. "You could always say a very stubborn salvage pilot found you." She looked at him with a small trace of amusement. "They will ask why that pilot chose to help a stranger without reward." Daniel shrugged lightly. "Because she needed help." The princess regarded him for a long moment as the quiet hum of the ship's systems filled the cockpit. The thoughtful expression in her golden eyes deepened. Among the Dominions, such an answer would be considered unusual. Daniel tapped the navigation panel and confirmed the plotted route. The star map shifted again, displaying a long chain of destinations that stretched across several systems toward the distant Dominion capital. "Humans are unusual," he said simply. Outside the cockpit, the asteroid slowly rotated away from the ship's shadow, revealing a narrow path through the drifting rocks. The navigation computer marked the opening as a safe exit vector. Daniel watched the projection for a moment and then glanced toward the princess. "You know," he said calmly, "if everything goes according to plan, we might reach the capital without anyone realizing where you came from." She stepped closer to the window and gazed out at the endless field of stars beyond the asteroid cluster. "And if everything does not go according to plan?" Daniel smiled faintly while the ship's engines quietly prepared for departure. "Then we improvise." The princess nodded slowly as if accepting both possibilities while the horizon breaker waited patiently in the shadow of drifting stone, ready to carry its unlikely passengers toward a future that neither of them could fully predict. The horizon breaker drifted silently within the thinning edge of the asteroid field as Daniel Carter watched the navigation timer count down the final minutes before departure. Outside the cockpit window, the slow-turning rocks glided past like ancient sentinels guarding the quiet corner of space that had hidden them long enough to plan their next move. The distant blue star of the system cast pale light across the hull of the ship, while faint reflections shimmered along the cockpit glass. Daniel rested one hand on the engine controls, waiting for the exact moment when the surrounding asteroid shadows would open into a clear escape corridor. Beside him, the alien princess stood calmly, her posture relaxed yet focused as she observed the star map glowing across the console. The planned route stretched across multiple systems in a thin arc of blue light leading gradually toward the Dominion capital far beyond the outer territories. 2 minutes, Daniel said quietly while glancing at the timer. The princess nodded but did not take her eyes off the map. Once we leave this field, we will be visible to any long-range scanner in the region. Daniel smiled faintly. That is why we will not stay visible for long. The navigation computer chimed softly, signaling that the jump drive had completed its final calibration. Daniel ran a quick diagnostic across the systems, and the display confirmed what he already expected. The horizon breaker was ready. He looked out at the stars beyond the drifting rocks and felt the familiar calm that came before every long jump through unknown space. For years his life had been simple. Find wrecks. Repair what could be repaired. Travel alone between quiet systems where nobody asked many questions. Then one frozen desert world and one mysterious escape pod had changed everything. The princess turned toward him slowly. The steady glow of her skin reflected across the control panel like soft starlight. Human Daniel Carter, she said thoughtfully. When this journey ends and the council hears what happened, your role will not go unnoticed. Daniel shrugged lightly as he adjusted the ship's course toward the narrow exit corridor forming between two massive asteroids. Recognition has never been high on my list of priorities. She studied him carefully. Many within the Dominion would consider you a hero for assisting their future ruler. Daniel chuckled quietly. I did not rescue a ruler. I rescued someone who needed help. The princess regarded him in silence for a moment as the navigation display confirmed the exit vector. Something in her expression softened again, the quiet respect that had slowly grown since the moment they met on the desert planet. That distinction, she said softly, is precisely what makes your species so unusual. Daniel guided the horizon breaker forward, and the ship glided between the final drifting rocks as the open starfield expanded ahead of them. The engines rose in a smooth, controlled hum while the asteroid shadows faded behind the vessel. The navigation computer counted down the final seconds before jump. 5, 4, 3. Daniel glanced once toward the princess. She stood beside him looking out into the vast sea of stars that waited ahead. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then the jump drive engaged and the universe outside stretched into brilliant lines of light as the small human ship carried an alien princess toward a destiny that could change the balance of entire star systems. And somewhere far behind them in distant Dominion space, powerful leaders were about to discover that the future of their empire might now depend on the quiet decision of a human who had simply opened an escape pod.